we were just talking about this debate between the Bernie-crat Democratic Party left and the corporate-aligned Clintonite Democratic Party establishment. There's also a debate of sorts between the Democratic Party Bernie-crat left on the one hand and the wide spectrum of people on the socialist left on the other over how and whether to engage the Democratic Party. And WFP typically flexes its muscle to back left candidates in Democratic primaries. And we do have a two-party system, unfortunately, so that makes sense to me on some level, but also maintains independence and sometimes runs people outside the Democratic Party line. What's your overall take on this debate and on what the right approach is?
I think that the Democratic Party is the playing field more than it is it's a piece of infrastructure that can be mobilized by lots of different forces more than it is any specific ideology tied to it. I think we do live in a deeply broken, imperfect political system that doesn't well represent the variety of political views we have in America. But given single member districts and the high cost of running for office and first past the post election rules, there are a lot of things we could do to make that better. But given the system we have, parties in America are not really like parties in the rest of the world in that they don't really have fixed or consistent ideologies. But what they do have is ballot access. And in most cases, we try to be strategic, and when we want to elect people who we think will carry our values in public office, most of the time in most of the country, it's a lot easier to do that within the context of a Democratic primary than as a sort of minor party candidate who might face some of those structural problems that I named before, like the first past the post system, which ultimately points heavily in the direction of a two-party system. When you have first past the post, there's heavy incentives for people to sort themselves into two big categories. That said, when there are times that there isn't a candidate running in the Democratic field who suits our values, there certainly have been times where we've run outside of that and beat the Democrats head on running as a Working Families Party candidacy. I think the places where we've been able to do that are mostly places where we've built up the most reliable voting base and activist base over time by engaging in elections strategically, by engaging in elections that people see a meaningful path to change rather than inviting people to participate in politics as symbolism. We think politics really affects people's lives, and we don't tend to engage in it as symbolism only.
When WFP was founded in, what year was that? 2003?
1998 initially.
1998.
Yeah.
Its big idea was all about fusion voting, and that's no longer the case. Can you explain a little bit about?
Sure, that's right. So yeah, fusion voting in some states is known as cross endorsement. It is essentially just an election law that means that a minor party can and a major party can endorse the same candidate. So the ultimate impact of that is you might go to vote in New York City. And when you go to vote, you'll see, we were just talking about Mayor de Blasio. You'll see Mayor de Blasio appear on the Democratic line and again on the Working Families Party ballot line. And so we tell people when they vote on the Working Families Party ballot line, that's the way to send a message with your vote, to say where you want that candidate to be on the issues that matter to you, from affordable housing to policing to economic development, right? So we ask voters in states like New York and Connecticut and Oregon to always look for the Working Families Party ballot line as the progressive stamp of approval right on your ballot. So that was the main kind of growth strategy. That was the main, electoral strategy of the Working Families Party for a big piece of our history. And as we began to expand, we looked at states where we thought that either had a rule like that or a similar one, or we thought we had a path to passing a law like that one. So in Oregon, we started organizing in 2006 in Oregon with a plan to change the law and pass fusion voting, which we saw as at that time, necessary to build the Working Families Party. I think it was really the success of the Tea Party on the right that showed us the limitation of our thinking, which was that the Tea Party was this force that wasn't on the ballot at all, that wasn't using the fusion voting system, but still behaved like and saw itself as a political movement that was taking on both Democrats, who they saw as who they saw as an anathema, and Republicans, who they saw as too liberal for their tastes. And we looked at our own record and realized, especially in places like New York City, the city council races that I mentioned to you, a lot of our biggest victories had actually been in Democratic primaries that weren't really dependent on the reality of having a ballot line in the general election or not. So, in New York City, which is an overwhelmingly Democratic city, when Mayor de Blasio is reelected, the votes on the Working Families Party line, might be 5 or 6 or 8% of the vote, but it's not going to make a huge determinative difference on whether or not he becomes a mayor in a city as strongly Democratic as New York. So we realized that we didn't have to be so limited in our thinking to growing only where we had this, sort of quirky election law. It's, the fusion system is a great tool, we think, and it, existed all across the country a century ago. It was often used for allowing sort of urban industrial immigrant parties with rural populist farmer parties to work together on a common slate of candidates. And ultimately, the two-party establishment and the big banks managed to ban fusion in most states because they thought it's too powerful a tool to allow different constituencies like white workers and immigrant, native-born workers and immigrant workers to work together, or freed slaves in the Reconstruction South and rural white populists. Right? It was so it was a really powerful election law that was heavily used by the left until it was banned in most states. So that was the initial thinking. But we've since, changed our strategies a lot and realized that it's not a sort of critical prerequisite for the WFP to grow. And it's really been in the last 2 years or so that we've started rapidly growing new WFP state chapters and local branches, really all across the country.
How do you think that WFP's approach compares to that of DSA's, which is obviously very nascent, so it's hard to say what DSA's approach is because it's still being debated and developed. Do you see it as in contention with DSA's approach or more complementary? The approach I see being developed in DSA is like WFP. It's an instrumentalist relationship to the Democratic Party, but maybe a little more instrumental in the sense of seeing the Democratic Party ballot line more crudely just as a ballot line and hostilely seizing it to run open socialists. How do you see the two approaches?
That's a good question. I'm really eager to see the new energy that's in DSA, and I'm curious, watching pretty closely to see how their political practice develops. I think we broadly agree. I think I agree with the idea of the Democratic Party ballot line as a sort of piece of infrastructure and that you can seize in sort of more or less hostile terms. And I guess I would just say I'm eager to see how the DSA thinking develops. I think we are, I mentioned towards the top of the show that we, want to see. We believe that a plausible outcome to change is, Democrats in the majority in legislatures and progressives in the majority in those Democratic caucuses. We think that's a plausible path to being able to actually move progressive legislation. To arrive at that strategy can occasionally mean backing less than ideal Democrats if it means the control of the body is in play. We think that the difference between a Democratic-controlled state Senate versus a Republican-controlled state Senate is a big enough deal that a mediocre Democrat might earn our support over a terrible Republican if the control of the body as a whole is in play, and if we think we can make that upgrade, even if we don't, ourselves subscribe to every, every belief by a Democrat running in a swing district. I'm not sure that that's an approach that, DSA would take. And I think that's it's good that there's a multiplicity of organizations doing different things. But my view would be, if you look strategically at power, there are sometimes reasons to back candidates other than the candidates themselves.
I was just having a conversation with a friend about this last night, which is, why should we not be incredibly depressed by how thin the national level left bench is?
I think the reason we shouldn't be depressed is because for two reasons. One, because we have no choice but to continue to fight for what we believe in. But two, we shouldn't be depressed because there is an undeniable new wave of activist energy of people who want to participate. So we may not have as many, leading light senators. We may not have as many Bernies and Elizabeth Warrens as we wish we did, but we have an incredible number of people on the ground who are newly activated and more activated than ever, who see a path to leadership in politics and who have capacity for leadership. And that's what gives me a lot of hope.